Hello, students. Today we're going to look at the topic of bonds. So this video is meant to be an introduction to bonds, sort of what they are, the concept of how bonds work. Later videos, we're going to look at some numerical examples on how to account for bonds. But today we're just going to look at the characteristics of a bond and what that really is. So first of all, a bond is simply a contract, and it is a debt contract in that a corporation or a government entity needs to borrow a lot of money, and they put out a bond, which is really a bond contract, as debt, and investors purchase the bond. So investors hold this debt and they get periodic payments from the corporation or the government. So in terms of who issues bonds, only large corporations can issue bonds because first we're talking about a lot of money in terms of a cost to issue a bond, and we're usually talking in hundreds of millions of dollars altogether. So also governments or levels of government issue bonds. So sometimes municipalities issue a bond, and where you live, you may, if the larger the city you're in, the more likely they have outstanding bonds. So for example, if a city is going to build a new recreation complex and it's going to cost them $250 million, they obviously don't have $250 million, so they'll borrow it and they'll often use a bond issue to do that. So a bond has a couple of different characteristics compared to, let's say, a normal loan. First of all, there's a face value, or also called a maturity value, of the bond, and this is essentially the amount of money, more or less, that is borrowed, but it's definitely the amount of money that you will be repaid at the end of the bond's life or at maturity. So when the bond is to be repaid, we call that the maturity date, and the face value is repaid to the investor. So we say, well, what do you get? If you just get your face value or your money back, that's not very good. So you also get interest payments, or what's called a coupon payment, usually every 6 months. So a coupon is simply based on an interest rate, and that would be something like, let's say, a 6% bond. So if you bought a 6% bond with a $1,000 face value, you would get $60 interest a year, and that would be split usually over 2 payments of 30, so $30 every 6 months. So the thing to remember here is the coupon rate determines the periodic payment. So in my example, the payment of 30 2 times a year represents a $1,000 bond times a 6% coupon rate. The face value is the amount repaid at maturity. So the investor has 2 inflows of cash. Bonds are usually long-term. So, 10, 15, 20 years, even 30 years isn't uncommon. So if I were an investor, I might get $30 every 6 months for 20 years, and then I get $1,000 at the end when the bond matures. So we have a couple of issues here. One, if you remember IFRS accounting standards versus ASPE, well, they could handle bond interest a different way in accounting. But most companies that are large enough to issue a bond, you are international or certainly publicly traded companies, and they're using IFRS. So in later videos, we're going to look at how to account for bonds using what we call the effective interest method, and that follows IFRS. So here's an interesting thing about bonds. We said the payment is fixed because the payment is based on, again, the coupon rate times the face value of the bond. So what happens when the market interest rates are higher or lower than the coupon rate? So take, for example, a period of rising interest rates. So you'll recall that, post-pandemic, we had rising mortgage rates, rising interest rates all over the place. So a bond might be paying 4%, but interest rates prevailing for investors are that they can get 6% pretty much anywhere. They could even get 6% by putting their money in the bank for a year. So there's a discrepancy between what the bond pays and what investors are requiring. So we have to say, well, if investors require 6% and the bond pays 4%, then no one will buy that bond unless there's a mechanism in place where they can actually earn the 6%. Remember, the payment that you get every 6 months is fixed, and the maturity value is fixed. The only way that we can turn 4% into 6% is for the investor to give the issuing corporation less for that bond than the face value, so less than $1,000. So think of it this way: if I were an investor and I needed 6% return on my money, or I'm not going to buy that bond, and like nobody else is either, then the bond price will be bid down until my investment, let's just say, for example, I give them $940. So instead of giving them $1,000, I invest $940. I still get the $30 every 6 months. I still get the $1,000 when the bond matures, but my investment is $940. So what I've done is I've earned 6%. And the other thing that happens here is the company that issued the bond knows that they got $940, right? They said, oh, we'll pay you $1,000 in 20 years, but I'm only getting $940 now. Well, they know that represents 6%, so they accrue their interest at 6%. So you can see that this is sort of an interesting thing that's going on, and we're going to explore that topic further, looking at examples where a company receives less for the bond than face value, called a discount, and instances where they receive more, called a premium.